Hello, my name is Dr. Matthew Potter and I'm Curator of Limerick Museum. Welcome to our online symposium on Limerick in 1921, which is part of Limerick City and County Council Decade of Centenaries programme, organised by Damien Brady and Tony Stone at Limerick Library Service. 1921 was an important year in the War of Independence, both nationally and here in Limerick. I want to thank all our speakers for contributing to this event, and I hope you will all enjoy what will be a very interesting and important contribution to the events of 1921.
The Drumkeen ambush, which took place in County Limerick on the 3rd of February 1921, could to a large extent be termed the Forgotten Ambush. In terms of the Irish War of Independence, it was the second largest ambush in terms of Crown Force fatalities. Only the ambush at Kilmichael in November 1920, where 16 auxiliaries and 3 IRA were killed, could be regarded as being of greater extent. The Drumkeen ambush, for various reasons, has been to a large extent forgotten. That those reasons lie in the fact that when the Free State went into power, they distanced themselves from the War of Independence to a large extent. Now, most of the men who took part in Drumkeen, but by no means all, went pro-treaty. When Dev came into power in the 1930s, obviously he wasn't going to give too much credit to fellows who took the other side. Coming back to Drumkeen, the RIC in County Limerick were reorganised in the summer of 1920. The garrison at Fedimore, which had always traditionally been part of the Bruff district, was transferred to the Pallasgreen district. Now, Fedimore is about 4 to 6 miles from Bruff. It's about 15 miles from Pallasgreen. The Pallasgreen district now had 5 barracks, 5 garrisons. One at Pallasgreen, one at Rula, one at Cappamore, and one at Doon, and one away 15 miles to the west at Fedimore. Once a month, the district inspector in Pallasgreen, the district headquarters were at Pallasgreen, and once a month, the district inspector at Pallasgreen would travel to Fedimore with wages and supplies. This convoy of 2 lorries, normally 2 lorries, was picked up by John Purcell in Callahan, who was the intelligence officer for the 3rd Battalion of the East Mid-Limerick Brigade. Purcell informed his OC, Dick O'Connell, and Dick O'Connell made plans for an ambush. However, O'Connell soon realised that he really didn't have the manpower. The Mid-Limerick Flying Column, whilst it was fairly active, wouldn't have been sufficiently strong to take on a convoy, maybe 2, possibly even 3 lorries. So he got together with Donegal Hannigan, the OC of the East Limerick Flying Column, and together they came up with a plan for an ambush. The ambush was originally planned for between Ballinity and Callahan, but it was realised that the convoy didn't always take that route. The one thing that they knew about the convoy was that it took the route from Pallasgreen to almost to Callahan continuously, to Drumkeen. they continuously took that route. They sometimes diverged from between Fedamore and Drumkeen. So it was decided that the best place to ambush was at Drumkeen. As I said, the man who identified the convoy was John Purcell from Callahan, who's the intelligence officer of the Limerick Brigade. The site for the ambush was quite close to Drumkeen House. There was about 3/4 of a mile of a straight stretch of road which went downhill. There was a church and a graveyard on one side which overlooked the road. There were stone walls on all sides. And down at the cross, there was down at Powers Cross at the end of the ambush site, there was two road blocked off to the left and to the right. And it was easy to block off the roads leading out of the ambush position without the convoy being aware that they were in danger. At the top of the ambush position at McCarthy's house was a right angle turn. So when the second lorry turned the bend, heading down the road, it was very easy for the IRA to come out from McCarthy's and open fire. In total, so the ambush site says the men from the East Limerick flying column were on the right-hand side, largely in the graveyard. Now, they overlooked much of the road and much of the ambush position. Men on the left-hand side were from the Mid-Limerick column. Down at Powers Cross, the headquarters unit under Donegal Hannigan had a view back up the road, and that's where Hannigan himself was situated. Now, in all the houses, the farmhouses around the ambush position, IRA men were dispositioned. The main group, however, was in McCarthy's yard, under the control of David Gearan of Kilteely. They were the men who would know that when the second lorry had turned the bend, they would be in a position to open fire and begin the ambush. The ambush lasted only about 5 minutes. Accounts would say that it lasted only about 5 minutes. As I say, one of the first casualties was the driver of the second lorry, Milling. In the first lorry, driven by Constable Cox, he heard the firing from behind, up the road, and as he drove down to turn at Powers Cross, he was turning to the left for Drumkeen when he spotted the barricade. He turned the lorry around and attempted to go for Old Palace, and in doing so, he hit the bank of the road and the lorry overturned. The three men in the back of the lorry, Burke, Callahan and can't think of the third man, were killed almost straight away. But the two in the front, Inspector Sanson and William Cox. Cox was the driver of the first lorry, and both of those men were wearing civilian clothes. They jumped out of the lorry. They weren't injured by the turning over. They jumped out of the lorry and started running down the road. Because they were in civilian clothes, the IRA hesitated to open fire, and it gave both Cox and Sanson a chance to get away, and they jumped in over the ditch and actually escaped from the ambush position. Eventually, they came across a farmer who was spreading dung, a man by the name of Paddy O'Brien, and they forced him to take them in the horse and cart to Drumkeen. As I said, they were the only two people that escaped. There were 8 men in the second lorry, and that was brought to a halt somewhere near the graveyard. And although the men the policemen in that lorry put up a fight, they were all silenced within a couple of minutes. When the IRA came out onto the road and they inspected the 2 lorries, the 3 men in the front lorry, Ruairc, Callahan and the 3rd man were dead. In the 2nd lorry, however, they discovered that 2 of the occupants, Samuel Adams, and we believe the 2nd man was possibly Michael Doyle or Foodie, Constable Foodie, Patrick Foodie. We would give probably Patrick Foodie. They were shamming death, and they were taken and they were tried by court-martial, and the 2 of them were executed. Now, as I say, the court-martial was held 5 officers, but the man who executed them was Morris Mead. Now, unfortunately, Morris Mead did not do a very clean job of executing Constable Adams, because Adams was taken into McCarthy's house, and he was in a dying state, but he still could tell Mrs. McCarthy that they shot me and I had my hands up. In later years, Mrs. McCarthy made contact with Adam's mother, and the 2 ladies exchanged letters for the rest of their lives. At this stage, the IRA, as I say, had wiped out the 2 lorries. A number of men who had been in the post office in Drumkeen, which was taken over by the IRA under a group under Brian Berkby. They didn't destroy the telephone committee equipment, which is surprising, but it meant that the postmaster was in a position to ring for the doctor. He also had to contact the garrison at Palace Green, because if he hadn't contacted him, I'd say he would have had a lot of serious questions to answer. The remaining garrison from Palace Green marched to Drumkeen, and they came on what we call a desperate sight. The 2 lorries were burned out, turned up on their side, and the bodies were strewn around the road. The doctor that came to the ambuscade was Dr. Corby from Callahan, and Corby also heard what Constable Adams had to say, that he had been shot and he had his hands up when he was shot. The upshot of the Drumkeen ambush was one of the IRA, Liam Hayes, was badly wounded in the hand. He lost the thumb and first finger of his left hand, but it was believed that he was, dare I say it, wounded by fire, friendly fire, from the other side of the road. He was from Kilteely, and as I say, he was the only casualty on the IRA part. The ambushers, after the ambush, the East Limerick men went towards Lochburg, and the Mid Limerick men headed for Bohermore, near Ballinity. The ambush as such was ruthless, but it was also, dare I say, a certain levelling of scores, because prior to Drumkeen, the IRA had suffered a lot of casualties in conflict with the Crown forces. At Cahergilmore, 5 IRA had been killed. A number of other IRA men were killed at Ballylanders. Tommy Murphy and David Tobin were killed at Ballylanders in around the same time, around New Year's Day, 1921. In Emily, William Slater was, they said, dragged behind a lorry before he was finished off. So in total, we say, there was quite a number of fatalities suffered by the IRA in the period from December to January 1921. But at Drumkeen, as I said, 11 RIC black and tans were killed. Now, of the 11, 3 of them were old members of the RIC: Constable Burke, Constable Callahan, and Constable Prudy. They were old RIC men. Constable Doyle is an interesting character. He was a black and tan, but he had worked in the Knocklang area before he joined the British Army in the First World War. And he had been living in the 1911 census. He was living near Knocklang, between Hospital and Knocklang. He was married. He was a groom at Kilcrush. Overall, as I say, the number of fatalities at Drumkeen was the second highest in terms of the War of Independence. After the ambush at Drumkeen, there were quite a number of reprisals. The one person who was very lucky actually was a man called Matty Casey, who worked in Palace Green. And when the Black and Tans got back to Palace Green after seeing the surviving Black and Tans that were in Palace, when they came back to Palace after being at the ambush site, they had blood in their eyes, and they rounded up this man, Matty Casey. He was a local cobbler, I think he was a cobbler, and they were stringing him up against the wall, going to execute him. And Mrs. O'Dwyer, who owned the local public house where the Black and Tans used to drink, she shouted, lads, drinks on the house, come on, drinks on the house. So there I said, the lust for drink overcame the lust for revenge, thankfully for Matty Casey. The first house that was burned in reprisal for the ambush, now as I said, the ambush took place on a Thursday evening, and the first house burned in reprisal was Liam Hayes' house at Ballinlough near Kilteely. It was burnt to the ground on the Saturday morning. So one could say it was a very bad week for Liam Hayes. He lost a thumb and a finger on Thursday, and he lost a house on Saturday. Other houses that were burned around the place were Mackey's and Carroll's, both near Drumkeen. Kennedy's Portnard, which was burned in error. Now, but that was not much use to Kennedy's, but the house was burned in error. The British military admitted that later. It was a different Kennedy they had intended, whose house they intended to burn. In Callahan, 2 houses were burned, O'Connell's and Lynch's. Now, O'Connell's was the public house that would have been known in later years as the Big Tree. In Ballybricken, Porty's and Hennessy's houses were burned. In Cappamore, Willie Gleeson, he took part in the ambush. As I said, the Hennessy's and Porty's, they took part, and the British knew it. Willie Gleeson's workshop was burned in Cappamore. There were other houses burned around the place. Buckley's of Corlish, right? Now, one thing that stands out, in reprisal for the ambush at Drumkeen, there were no people shot dead, and it is believed and credited that a lot of that was due to the humanity of the inspector, Sanson, Adam Sanson. Now, Sanson may have made a lot of mistakes in the way he used to do his convoys from Drumkeen to Fedamore. As I said, they became too predictable. But as a person, it seems to be a very decent man, and he forbade any revenge shootings. It must be one of the biggest surprises, in the sense that it was the second biggest ambush in the whole of the War of Independence, and there was no one shot dead in the reprisal. Now, as I say, that would be, dare I say it, in my view, largely down to our friend Sanson. Now, as I say, you asked the question, why was Drumkeen overlooked and forgotten? Mainly, the majority of the leadership went to Free State. Now, they didn't all go Free State. Sean Carroll from Castleconnell was staunchly Republican, and Carroll actually has a unique distinction. He did a flying column in the Civil War. He was never captured. Now, nearly all the leading Republicans were captured before the end of the Civil War, but not Sean Carroll. And bear in mind that at that stage, Sean Carroll was 45 years of age. He was very old for for a man as active as he was. When Dave came to power in the 30s, because very few of the leaders of the ambush, there said went Fianna Fáil. He didn't give too much recognition. Now, I suppose you can't blame him with that score. Also, there was no memorial put up to the Drumkeen ambush until 12 years ago. There was no signpost. There was no signpost marking the ambush site until about 2 years ago. So as I said, that the popular narrative totally overlooks the ambush. As I say, even today, there's very little signage from the County Council. Anyhow, that's what I have to say about Drumkeen.
Cato Callahan said of the Irish Civil War, "Women do not cry much in Ireland during this war. The trouble goes too deep." Kate was all too familiar with this sentiment. She saw far more than her fair share of trouble both during the Irish Civil War and in the years that followed. This talk for the Limerick Museum will detail the story of Cato Callahan and the significant events in her life during 1921. Cato Callahan was born Kate Murphy in Crossman, County Cork, on the 11th of October 1885. She was one of the elder children of the large family of Cornelius Murphy, a farmer and blacksmith, and Julia Kelleher. The 15-year-old was not at home when the 1901 census was carried out. It is presumed that she was in education in St. Mary's Dominican College, Dublin at the time. On the census return for that year, her parents claimed to speak both Irish and English. This was a skill they passed down to all their children. By 1911, when Julia was a widow, she completed that year's census return in Irish. Her parents also passed on a strong belief in education for all genders equally, and a sense that politics was not beyond the reach of women. Following her secondary education in Dublin, she attended the Royal University of Ireland, where she received a Bachelor's of Arts degree. She then attended a teacher training college in Cambridge, England. In 1909, she arrived in Limerick to take up a teaching post at Mary Immaculate Teacher Training College. When she first moved to Limerick, she lived with her older sister Mary and Mary's husband, Diarmuid O'Donovan. Mary was also a lecturer in Mary Immaculate College. Their younger sister Ailish would later join the staff of the college. In 1911, the O'Donovan household, which included Kate, completed their census return in Irish. Interestingly, they also included Mary and Kate's level of education. In 1914, Kate married Michael Callahan. His father's family owned a large tannery in Limerick, while his mother, Ellen Smithwick, was of the Kilkenny brewing family. His grandfather, Eugene O'Callahan, was Mayor of Limerick in 1864. So, like Kate, an interest in politics was in his blood, as was the promotion of Irish culture. He was a member of the first Sinn Féin club formed in Limerick in 1905 and joined the Irish Volunteers in 1914. He was elected to Limerick City Council for the first time in 1911 and remained on the council until his untimely death. In January 1920, he was unanimously elected Mayor of Limerick, a post he held for the traditional 1 year. While Mayor of Limerick, Kate's husband attended the funeral of murdered Mayor of Cork, Tomás McCurtain, after which he began receiving death threats. In early 1921, after his tenure as mayor had ended, he continued to receive these death threats. On the night of the 7th of March 1921, Kate was at home with her husband when the house was raided by armed men. Her husband, Michael Callahan, was shot dead in front of her. Little did she know at the time that on the same night, only a few hundred meters away, his successor as mayor and friend, George Clancy, was also murdered. Volunteer Joseph O'Donoghue was also murdered that night. Kate and Molly Clancy, the widow of Mayor Clancy, refused to attend the military inquiry into the deaths of their husbands, as they believed the military were involved in their husband's murder, so the correct assailants would not be identified at the inquiry. Kate soon put pen to paper, producing a pamphlet, The Limerick Curfew Murders, where she outlined the events that led up to the tragic night and what happened during the course of the night. Many years later, her suspicions over the identity of the murderers would be confirmed. In an article in the New Statesman in 1961, it was claimed that O'Callahan was shot by an auxiliary named George Nathan, while in 1982, the Limerick Leader identified two Black and Tans, Sergeants Leach and Horn, as being involved in the deaths. The murder of the two councillors left two vacant seats on the Limerick Council. One of these seats was filled by Mary O'Donovan, Kate's sister. She was only the second woman to sit on Limerick Council. Before the year was out, Mary would don the mayoral chain as the Deputy Mayor of Limerick. She was the first woman to wear the chain. This was an act not repeated for another 40 years. Kate's political career, however, went much higher. In May 1921, Kate ran for national politics on the Sinn Féin ticket for the Limerick City, Limerick East constituency. She was elected as one of the so-called Black Widow TDs in the second Dáil. Another of the female TDs elected was Limerick woman Kathleen Clark ní Daly, the widow of Thomas Clark, who was executed for his role in the 1916 Easter Rising. During her time in politics, Kate was under surveillance of the British Intelligence Office, who referred to her as a clever and dangerous woman who makes the most of propaganda and her fanatical hatred of the Crown forces. They would go on to say that she was closely related to notorious rebel families in County Cork, and also that her sister, Mrs. O'Donovan, was even more bitter. In October 1921, Kate spoke at the local branch of the Gaelic League in Hospital, County Limerick, where she stated, "But for the Gaelic League, the country would never have been ready for the Irish Volunteers. The Rising in 1916 and the war that lasted from January 1919 till the Truce. The great separatists, Pádraig Pearse, Sean McDermott and Terence McSweeney, were Gaelic Leaguers because they realised that separation of thought and tongue would burst the chains that bound Ireland. The Irish Republican Army fought to make this a reality. Please God, we shall see that separation a reality, and soon. If a plebiscite of women were taken in 1914, there would have been no European war, no slaughter of millions, no agony, no famine. But the Irish War is not for commercial supremacy, for empire, but a war against oppression, against injustice, against slavery. And in it, every true Irishwoman stands behind her menfolk. Such a war of freedom is a stern duty to a just cause, a bloody protest for a glorious thing. Daniel Connolly used to say that no cause was worth shedding one drop of blood. We know now we have got our present unbeaten position through the blood of many of our best, bravest, and dearest. It is our duty to see that we stand firm by what they died for, the Irish Republic. In the last weeks of 1921, the Dáil was embroiled in the anti-treaty debates. Kate stood firmly as an anti-treaty TD. She delivered a speech against the treaty on the 20th of December 1921, stating that she had been a separatist since childhood and wanted to see an independent Ireland outside of the British Empire. She would stick to her beliefs and voted against the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Kate was voted back into government in 1922. In April 1923, she was arrested and taken to Kilmainham jail for attending a political funeral. She was released after a 19-day hunger strike. She left active politics that year and returned to Mary Immaculate College. But in 1937, she made it very clear that she opposed the new constitution on several points, including that she felt the articles relating to women were a betrayal of the 1916 promise of equal rights and equal opportunities guaranteed to all citizens, and posed a grave threat to the future position of women. Kate never remarried, nor did she have any children. She lived in Limerick on O'Callahan Strand, which was named after her late husband. She died in Limerick on the 16th of March, 1961.
Moriamh agus míl maithagah as 8 mhór go lúidear. Ar dús rih má pápéir caithfidh mé mo bhuíochas a gháil chuig corda Hyundai limní as 8 an chora chun caimplibh in Neamh. So the title of my paper is 11th Hour Warriors, the final actions of the War of Independence in Limerick, the 8th to the 11th of July 1921. The Anglo-Irish Truce of the 11th of July 1921, more commonly known in Ireland simply as the Truce, ended the Irish War of Independence, which had resulted in over 2,000 fatalities. The ceasefire was of huge significance nationally, but also made international newspaper headlines and was registered as a formal agreement with the League of Nations. Though they had not inflicted a military defeat on their foe, Irish Republicans had nonetheless won a major propaganda victory by forcing the British to agree to a formal bilateral ceasefire, which effectively bestowed belligerent status on the IRA, whom the British had previously dubbed a murder gang and who they now referred to in official documentation as, quote, the Irish Army. A ceasefire on similar terms had been possible in late 1920, but these fledgling peace manoeuvres had been undermined firstly by a clamour of minor Republican politicians who sought peace at any cost, giving the impressions that the rebels were desperate, and secondly in Downing Street, where the British Army continually asserted that they were on the cusp of victory, and Lloyd George insisted on punitive conditions including a complete surrender of arms by the IRA, which made peace and any form of ceasefire impossible until the British Prime Minister withdrew them. When the ceasefire eventually came in July of 1921, Warren Fisher, a senior British civil servant, welcomed the truce, stating, quote, better late than never, but I cannot get out of my mind the unnecessary number of graves. Unquote. This paper will examine some of the popular myths and misconceptions which still abound a century later regarding the deaths which occurred in the final days and hours of the conflict. It will also look at how these have been built into a historical narrative dominant over the last century, which depicted the final days of the War of Independence not as the closing stage of military conflict, but as a criminal campaign of score settling, sectarian murder and indiscriminate killings by the IRA, whilst the British Crown forces supposedly stood idly by. In addition to examining the national, political and military context, this paper will also examine the IRA's final military operations in Limerick in the dying days and hours of the war. Late on the afternoon of Friday, the 8th of July 1921, General Neville Macready, commander of the British Army in Ireland, met with representatives of Dáil Éireann and senior IRA officers at the Mansion House in Dublin. There, Macready and Republicans finalised the terms of a formal armistice between the British Crown forces and the IRA. The Anglo-Irish Truce was modelled on the armistice of the 11th of November 1918, with an agreement for a lengthy delay between the announcement of the ceasefire and its implementation in order to give both sides the opportunity to communicate news of the ceasefire to combatants on both sides who were still in the field. In his memoir, Annals of an Active Life, published just 3 years later, General Macready contrasted the supposed morality of the military campaigns waged by the rival forces in the final days and hours of the conflict. According to Macready's narrative, the British forces refrained from hasty and unnecessary last-minute military offensives, whilst the IRA escalated their military campaign. Quote, the truce will begin at 12 noon on the 11th of July 1921, until which time the British troops, while taking no risks, should abstain as far as possible from unnecessary activity against the rebels, who, far from intimating such chivalrous forbearance, continued their campaign of outrage and assassination until the clock struck 12 on the 11th of July. End quote. Macready cited attacks on the British forces, the killing of civilians, and the destruction of loyalist homes as proof of the IRA's supposed campaign of outrage prompted by the announcement of the truce. Unsurprisingly, Republican fatalities and the deaths of Irish civilians killed by the British forces were conspicuously absent from Macready's account of the truce, which portrayed the final unnecessary killings as the sole work of the IRA. Histories which have consistently ignored the fatalities killed by the British have effectively resulted in a hierarchy of victimhood in which the victims of Republican violence are remembered in great detail and the victims of British violence are consistently ignored. This has enabled the creation of a myth that Republicans aggressively exploited the announcement of the truce as an opportunity to engage in sectarian murder and launch a wave of unjustifiable attacks on, quote, soft targets, whilst the British supposedly withdrew to their barracks to passively await the beginning of the ceasefire. This myth originated as anti-Republican propaganda created by the British in Dublin Castle during the War of Independence, which was fed to the press. The same narrative was subsequently adopted by the pro-treaty side both during and after the Irish Civil War. For example, P.S. O'Hegarty's 1924 book, The Victory of Sinn Féin, condemned the IRA as, quote, a terrorist army of tin pikemen, end quote, who had shied away from danger during the conflict, but who sprang into action at the last moment. Quote, all the young men in all the counties who had kept aloof of the fighting when it was dangerous were now eager to become heroes and to be able to tell stories of this and that ambush, end quote. Likewise, Piers Beasley, the IRA's former Director of Publicity, in his 1926 biography of Michael Collins, also castigated IRA units who later opposed the treaty by claiming that they contributed little to the Republican military campaign before the truce was announced. Quote, a great many 11th hour warriors in comparatively peaceful parts of the country hastened to make up arrears by firing shots at the last moment, and there were attacks on the English forces up to within a few minutes of the truce. These belated exhibitions of prowess with no military objective when the danger seemed past reflected no credit on Irishmen, end quote. The narrative that the IRA exploited the announcement of the truce as an opportunity to commit war crimes was not confined to the memoirs of participants in the War of Independence and Civil War who sought to denigrate Republicans to further their own political agendas. The same narrative has frequently reoccurred in popular histories such as Richard Bennett's The Black and Tans, Robert Key's The Green Flag, and Tim Pat Coogan's The IRA. Before permeating academic histories, and these have included Peter Hart, who stated that local IRA units had advanced knowledge of the truce, and Hart claimed that this led to an increase in Republican violence that was deliberately calculated to inflict fatalities on the British forces and kill loyalist civilians and other soft targets. Hart claimed that anti-Protestant sectarianism perpetrated by the IRA continually increased until the ceasefire took effect on the 11th of July 1921. According to Hart, the IRA engaged in a spate of unwarranted killings after the truce was announced. Quote, many guerrilla units made a point of killing as many people as possible up to the last minute, end quote. In fact, of the 62 fatalities which occurred nationwide between the announcement of the truce on the 8th of July 1921 and its implementation at noon on the 11th of July 1921, the IRA and nationalists in Belfast inflicted 53% of the fatalities, whilst the British Crown forces and Belfast loyalists inflicted 47% of the fatalities. Although the rival Irish and British forces inflicted an almost equal number of fatalities in the final days of the conflict, the one-sided narrative focusing solely on Republican violence has persisted, and this ignores violence by the British Crown forces and the British Crown forces as a whole, except as the victims of Republican violence. This biased narrative has not been limited to academic histories and popular histories. The same narrative regularly features in television documentaries, radio programs, and most frequently in newspaper columns published for decades in the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, and Sunday Independent. Most recently, the same narrative featured in RTE's Century Ireland website this year. Consequently, it is worth examining the final actions of the War of Independence in Limerick to see if there is any truth in such allegations. The first case worth examining in Limerick is that of John Maloney, a civilian shot by members of the IRA who were probably acting without official sanction. The likelihood is that Maloney's killing was not political, but nonetheless there have been various claims that the IRA executed Maloney as a, quote, spy, possibly in pursuance of a vendetta against ex-British soldiers. At 11:30 p.m. on Thursday the 7th of July, two armed men called at the house of John Maloney at Callahan, Bruff, County Limerick. The pair presented themselves as being from the military, i.e. the British Army, and told Maloney to come with them. One of the lodgers in Maloney's house, James Myers, attempted to follow them and was warned to return to the house and not to leave for 5 hours. Maloney was taken a short distance from his home and shot twice. Myers heard the shots fired but did not leave the house to investigate or go to Maloney's aid. Had he done so, it is possible that Maloney would have survived. At 5:20 the following morning, the 8th of July, Maloney was discovered by Pádraig Carroll, who had been walking from the town of Bruff to Knockinaty. Carroll had heard groaning and discovered Maloney lying mortally wounded at the side of the road. Maloney asked Carroll for a drink of water, and Carroll went immediately to Maloney's house and returned with his lodger, Myers. Myers went to Bruff to fetch Dr. John Meade and to inform Maloney's family, who were then living with Maloney's mother-in-law. Carroll went to get the local priest, Father Cousins, but Maloney died before anyone could return with either medical or spiritual aid. Dr. Meade pronounced Maloney dead and later gave evidence to a British military inquiry into his death that Maloney had died from a single gunshot wound fired between his neck and shoulder whilst he was in a stooping or kneeling position. John Maloney, also known as Jack, was a 47-year-old ex-soldier who served in the British Army during the First World War. He worked as a process server or civil bill officer serving writs. Maloney was separated from his wife at the time of his death and was apparently an alcoholic. John Maloney was shot at 7:30 p.m. but did not die until after 5:20 a.m. on the 8th of July. Therefore, the announcement of the truce at 3 p.m. on the 8th of July could not have been a factor in his death. One possible motivation for Maloney's killing was a vendetta relating to a family dispute. The British Military Court of Inquiry into Maloney's death established that Maloney's drinking and resultant behaviour had caused his wife and children to leave the family home at Callahan the previous week. Maloney had refused his son Willie entry to the house on the evening of his death, and Willie Maloney then sought the assistance of the local Royal Irish Constabulary and spent the night at the RIC barracks. Maloney's killers may have taken advantage of his wife and children's absence from the family home in order to carry out Maloney's execution. John Callahan's research has indicated that Maloney's death, quote, may have been at least partially dictated by the recent escalation of his family dispute, end quote. If the recent unrest in the Maloney family and his wife and children's absence from the family home were factors in Maloney's execution, then his death was probably coincidental to the announcement of the truce later that day. Even if Maloney's execution was based entirely on the IRA's suspicion that he might have been a British spy, it is highly unlikely that those who plotted and carried out his execution would have had any knowledge of the truce, which provincial IRA leaders had not yet received any notice of and which had yet to be formally agreed to. The Limerick IRA cannot be said to have been in the grip of a bloodlust at the time. Republicans released numerous alleged spies whom they had identified and captured in the immediate pre-truce period. Just a few hours before the truce came into effect, the IRA's Mid-Limerick Brigade took non-fatal action against George Ryan, a spy they had unmasked who had initially been sentenced to death. Ryan, a lieutenant in the Fedamore Company of the IRA, had been caught sending intelligence information by post to the Royal Irish Constabulary in Limerick City. The local IRA officers court-martialed Ryan in absentia and sentenced him to death. In accordance with IRA general orders, the Mid-Limerick Brigade sent a request to IRA GHQ seeking permission to carry out Ryan's execution, but this was refused. Instead, the Mid-Limerick Brigade was instructed to fine Ryan £100, destroy his house and sentence him to permanent exile, giving him just 24 hours to leave the country. This sentence was carried out at 1 a.m. on the 11th of July when a group of armed and masked IRA volunteers raided Ryan's farm at Fedamore, burning his house and its associated farm buildings to the ground. The IRA's Mid-Limerick Brigade was also holding 2 suspected spies prisoner at the time of the truce. The pair had been in IRA custody for up to 5 months, but it was felt that there was insufficient evidence of their guilt to warrant their execution, and both men were released on the 11th of July 1921 at 12 noon, as soon as the ceasefire took effect. Following the announcement of the truce, the IRA also attempted to assassinate 2 British Army officers who were travelling by car from Kilmallock to Kilfinnan at 5:20 p.m. on the 10th of July. The officers came under fire from IRA volunteers hidden in ambush at Ballinagady near Kilmallock. The officers who were wearing civilian clothes managed to escape from the ambush after returning fire. One of the officers, Lieutenant Harold Brown, was wounded in the attack. Brown was an intelligence officer attached to the garrison of the Machine Gun Corps stationed in Kilmallock. He was a very effective intelligence officer, and the IRA made several previous attempts on his life. James Malone, the IRA intelligence officer who had plotted Brown's assassination, recalled, quote, "He had a little motor car that had steel plates all round. He travelled about the countryside as if he didn't give a damn about anything. Sometimes a soldier or policeman accompanied him, but he often travelled alone. He was often fired upon, but always got away safely." End quote. In December 1920, the IRA had succeeded in shooting Brown during an ambush at Red Gate in the Kilmallock district, but he emerged unscathed from the attack, apparently because he had been wearing body armour under his clothes. The nature of the attack at Kilmallock on the 10th of July, and in particular Brown's presence, indicates that this operation was a planned assassination attempt rather than an opportunistic attack on any available, quote, soft target. Lieutenant Brown's role as an intelligence officer ensured his status from an IRA perspective as a high-profile, legitimate military target, regardless of whether or not the war was due to end. Furthermore, the clandestine nature of Brown's intelligence activities would have made it impossible for the IRA to tell at any given time if he was off-duty or actively engaged in intelligence work. As a result, there can be little doubt as to the legitimate military nature of this attack. It was the type of attack which had occurred frequently in County Limerick and was motivated by the necessities of the IRA's intelligence war. As such, it appears that the timing of this attack and its proximity to the truce were entirely coincidental, although news of the impending ceasefire had probably reached Brown's ambushers at the time. Despite the hackneyed and questionable claim that the IRA, quote, had only enough ammunition left for 2 weeks, end quote, which has largely arisen as a result of Neil Jordan's Hollywood movie about Michael Collins, the IRA's Limerick brigades were far from defeated by July of 1921, and they remained active in the field, planning and carrying out ambushes and other offensive operations on the British Crown forces until the ceasefire began. There were 2 IRA attacks on the British forces in Limerick on the 8th of July. The first was carried out by the IRA's Mid-Limerick Brigade at Cantor's Bridge near Bologna. There, the IRA were acting on reliable intelligence information received the previous month that the full strength of G Company of the RIC's Auxiliary Division, who were stationed at Killaloe, this would have amounted to approximately 150 men, were being transferred by rail to another posting. The Mid-Limerick Brigade mined the Bird Hill to Limerick railway line at Cantor's Bridge. The auxiliaries were due to cross the bridge at 8 a.m. that morning. However, shortly before their arrival, the route was searched by the British military. When the British soldiers discovered that the railway was mined and took cover, the IRA volunteers lying in ambush immediately opened fire. After a brief engagement, the IRA retreated as the sound of gunfire attracted British reinforcements. 1 soldier was wounded in the attack. The Cantor's Bridge ambush was one of the largest and most ambitious operations mounted by the IRA's Mid-Limerick Brigade. Its timing, the same day that the truce was announced, was entirely coincidental. The second IRA attack in Limerick on the day the truce was announced occurred at Drumkeen, where members of the East Limerick Brigade made a grenade attack on an RIC lorry. 1 RIC constable was wounded in the attack. The remaining members of the patrol escaped unscathed. This attack was carried out at a time when IRA personnel in Limerick were still unaware that a ceasefire had been announced, and the timing of the attack so close to the truce appears again to have been entirely coincidental. On the morning of the 10th of July, the East Limerick Brigade ambushed a 10-strong patrol of British soldiers from the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry in Mitchelstown, County Cork. The IRA had been planning an attack on the British garrison there for some time and had occupied ambush positions outside the town for over a fortnight, but no suitable target had presented itself. The most promising target which the IRA could identify was a 10-strong British Army patrol that regularly left Mitchelstown military barracks, escorting a water wagon to the fountain at the opposite end of the town. On the morning of Sunday the 10th of July, a force of 10 IRA volunteers armed with rifles and shotguns, supported by a reserve force of another 5 IRA volunteers armed with small caliber revolvers, emerged from the town's creamery, surprised the British soldiers and called upon them to surrender. When challenged, the British troops reached for their rifles instead of surrendering, and the IRA opened fire. 3 civilians, 2 British soldiers and 2 IRA volunteers were wounded in the ensuing gunfight, and the IRA captured 2 rifles from the British military. On Monday, the 11th of July 1921, 100 IRA volunteers lay in ambush in West Limerick, waiting for a convoy of British soldiers. Shortly before noon, their commander, Paddy O'Brien, was informed that his men who were stationed at Barna Gap that because the truce was about to come into effect, they were to return to their homes but should stand ready to take up arms again to defend the Irish Republic if necessary. At 12:15 p.m, just 15 minutes after the ceasefire began, British soldiers drove into the ambush position en route to Newcastle West and approached the IRA. Initially, the situation was tense, with some of the British soldiers attempting to seize the IRA's guns. But IRA Lieutenant Daniel Brown from Wheeling in Cork recalled, quote, "Eventually they said they would respect the truce and asked to exchange souvenirs. They said it was the first time they had ever seen the armed paddies," end quote. The overwhelming evidence from the testimony of both IRA and British Forces veterans is that they had no prior knowledge that the truce was imminent and that there was little or no time to plan for the settling of scores. Many of the combatants who took part in military operations between the 8th and the 9th of July did so in complete ignorance that the conflict was about to end, and they were primarily motivated by local tactical considerations. There is no credible evidence to suggest that IRA GHQ favoured or encouraged a policy of exploiting the advent of the truce for short-term military advantage or reprisal killings. A statistical analysis of the IRA's final military operations reveals that, contrary to previous claims, there was not a last-minute change in IRA tactics as part of an effort to inflict a maximum number of fatalities on their opponents before the truce began through attacks on so-called soft targets. There was a drop in the level of these attacks in the final days of the conflict, as the IRA concentrated instead on symbolic attacks on British barracks, which were less likely to cause British fatalities. Like IRA GHQ, the British Crown forces also cancelled a number of large-scale operations that had been planned once the truce was agreed. Although some British units continued to seek wanted Republicans for assassination, this was part of their standard operating procedure and not a last-minute surge. Standard British operations in the final days and hours also caused a significant number of civilian and Republican fatalities, but this had been the case throughout the conflict, and their occurrence so close to the ceasefire was entirely coincidental and cannot be considered as evidence of pre-ceasefire bloodlust on the part of the British forces. To conclude briefly, the Irish War of Independence began with 2 significant events on the 21st of January 1919. The first was the inaugural meeting of Dáil Éireann in Dublin, and the second was the shooting of 2 RIC constables in Solohead Beg, Tipperary. Whilst the Solohead Beg ambush is inextricably linked in our public consciousness with the national political events in Dublin. The fact is that the ambush was motivated by local military considerations, and its occurrence on the same day that Dáil Éireann first met was entirely coincidental. The same applies to the last fatalities of the War of Independence. These were inflicted after the announcement of the truce. Most of the military operations which caused these fatalities had either been planned in advance, in ignorance of political developments in Dublin, or were the result of immediate local events and conditions largely unrelated to the truce. There is no proof of a concerted military campaign by either side in Limerick or nationwide to inflict a maximum number of fatalities following the announcement of the truce. Claims that there were originated in contemporary propaganda, and in the remaining years of the decade of centenaries, it should be one of our priorities as historians and those interested in history to identify and disprove contemporary propaganda still masquerading as historical fact. So Sinné, Míle maith agaibh.
The title of the talk, The Conferring of the Freedom of Limerick on Eamon de Valera and the Signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, 5th to the 6th December 1921, the context and the significance of these events 100 years ago. A few words of introduction. Reflection on the basic facts surrounding the grant of the freedom of Limerick to Eamon de Valera on Monday, the 5th of December 1921, immediately lead one to a consideration of the events in Limerick which shaped the outcome of the Irish War of Independence. De Valera was joined by Mrs. Kathleen Clark in receiving the award. The report in the Limerick Leader of that day proudly spoke of the thousands of people who gathered in the streets as De Valera made his way to the Theatre Royal. And it also recorded that De Valera, on his arrival in Limerick from Clare, had lunch with Mrs. Maura O'Donovan in Eden Terrace before going on to the home of Stephen O'Mara Sr. at Strand House, where he was to stay the night. The report also recorded that Mrs. O'Donovan, the acting mayor of Limerick, was joined on the platform in the Theatre Royal by her sister, Mrs. Cantor Callahan, TD, and by Mrs. Molly Clancy. The names of the three women, a mention of the O'Mara family, serve to place the event in an immediate historical context. One is forced to focus on the savage murder of the husbands of Cantor Callahan and Molly Clancy by British Crown forces, which had taken place 9 months earlier on the night of the 6th to 7th of March 1921. It was this tragic event that propelled these women into a position of prominence and ultimately led to their leading roles in the reception for Eamon de Valera. As a result of the murders of the mayors, Maura O'Donovan was co-opted as an alderman of Limerick Corporation on the 7th of April 1921 as replacement for the murdered George Clancy. Stephen O'Mara Jr. had been elected mayor at an earlier meeting on the 22nd of March, and in his acceptance speech declared that he was honoured to be the Republican mayor of Limerick. When Stephen O'Mara, at De Valera's request, went to America as representative of the Irish Republic, he nominated Maura O'Donovan as the deputy mayor on the 21st of May. In the same month, Cantor Callahan was selected as one of the 4 Sinn Féin candidates for Limerick City, Limerick East, and was returned unopposed to the second Dáil on the 24th of May. The other candidates were Michael Collivet, Richard Hayes, and William Hayes. The two women, Cantor Callahan and her sister, were very able women and very talented. University degrees, professors at Mary I, and so they were well able to participate in Limerick life and national life, and they had done so, Common na Gael, Gaelic League, and were very active in Irish life in 1918, when things were becoming very bad in Limerick with the appointment of Lord French. And that gives us a reminder to note that the original grant of the freedom of Limerick to De Valera and Mrs. Kathleen Clark was made in 1918 during the regime of Lord French. A few dates. French was appointed Lord Lieutenant and Military Governor on the 11th of May 1918, an event which shaped the character of the War of Independence for several years. The 3rd of July 1918, he suppressed the Irish Volunteers, Common Namon, and the Gaelic League, and their leaders were imprisoned. On the 5th of September, the Limerick Corporation, in a unique contribution under the mayor of Alphonsus O'Mara, granted the freedom of Limerick to the leaders of the three national organisations: Volunteers, Common Namon, the Gaelic League. And in that context, De Valera, Owen MacNeill, Kathleen Clark received their awards. But only Owen MacNeill was available on the 7th of November to receive his award. That is how it came about that in 1921, in the midst of the treaty negotiations, De Valera received, and Mrs. Clark, their awards. A few words now on the treaty talks. The early origins of the treaty talks and Dáil Éireann's response. The official correspondence, remarkably, relating to the preliminary peace negotiations began with a letter from Lord George to De Valera on the 24th of June 1921. And I think it's worth noting that these were publicised. Many of the talks, the discussions, letters, were published in October 1921 as peace negotiations between Lloyd George and De Valera. And they show the knowledge and scope of both sides and give a clear idea of the skill that both sides had and the precision which they had. So the official correspondence began on the 24th of June. Finally, on the 8th of July, after further correspondence, De Valera agreed to begin talks, and these led to a truce which was announced on the 11th of July at the British military headquarters. The talks began on the 14th of July, and it was this process which culminated on the 5th/6th of December in the great event surrounding the grant of the freedom of Limerick to De Valera. So reflection on these talks and the events in Limerick, which were taking place at the same time, provides some background to that event. Firstly, a word about De Valera and Lloyd George's talks. De Valera was accompanied by some cabinet ministers and officials for these talks that began on the 14th of July, but not by Michael Collins, although De Valera did communicate with him during the talks. After much discussion, on the 20th of July, Lloyd George delivered a written proposal to De Valera to debate and reflect on, which did not contain any concession to the ideal of an Irish Republic. Lloyd George's proposal granted Ireland the status of a dominion. It directed that British naval and military forces have access to Irish territory, and it endorsed the Government of Ireland Act, that is, a six-county Ulster. The next day, 21st of July, De Valera met Lloyd George and rejected the proposals. Lloyd George responded by saying, "Do you realise that this means war?" There was no further discussion, and De Valera and his team left London that evening. The proposals that followed these talks were the main concern of the first meeting of the second Dáil, which Cato Callahan attended on the 16th, 17th and 21st of October. De Valera gave an appraisal of the talks and of Lloyd George's offer, which he said amounted to an offer of Dominion Home Rule. Then, on the 17th of August, he made reference to the Government of Ireland Act of December 1920 and called for a rejection of the British offer. The Dáil voted unanimously to reject the terms, and a letter to that effect was sent to Lloyd George on the 24th of August. When the Dáil met on the 26th of August, a new cabinet was formed, a smaller cabinet. Previously, all ministers were members of the cabinet, but the new cabinet omitted some of these ministers. And in a strange way, that was very significant, because one is possibly aware that the final cabinet vote was a very close one, majority of one in favour of the treaty, and by limiting the cabinet, people who would have voted against the treaty were barred. For example, Countess Markowitz and Count Plunkett. The talks then were put on hold for a time, but resumed after Harry Boland had gone on a mission to Gairloch and met Lloyd George in Scotland. So a few words now on the resumption of the talks. The final decision to renew the negotiations with Lloyd George was not made until the 7th of October, when it was decided to send a select team to London to conduct further negotiations. The 5 men chosen were Arthur Griffith, chairman, Michael Collins, Robert Barton, Eamon Duggan and Gavin Duffy. These men and a team of secretaries and advisors, among them Erskine Childers and John Charteris, departed for London. The Irish team engaged in detailed talks with their British counterparts, and as recorded in the Department of Foreign Affairs files, were in regular contact with De Valera. For example, a letter from Michael Collins to De Valera on the 2nd of October complained that, quotation, "This place is the bloody limit. I wish to God I were back home." End of quotation. Other letters that was kept private, but a letter concerning the role of Pope Benedict XV to the King on October 20th of October did cause concern to De Valera, as it appeared to grant some credence to the English claims over Ireland. He therefore wrote a public letter which was critical of the Pope. I think possibly at that time the Pope was in ailing health and was possibly being run by British officials or officials who were hostile to Ireland. While these negotiations were going on, a little flashback or to recall, consider events in Limerick. So while these negotiations were taking place, Cato Callahan and Mór O'Donovan were occupied in many events in Limerick which reveal their attitude to the talks and the issues at stake. On the 7th of October, Mór O'Donovan presided at a meeting of the corporation when it was resolved unanimously that the treatment of the men and women in internment camps was a scandal and against all precedents. Now that's a reminder to us that there were about 5,000 Irish prisoners held under the Defence of the Realm Act without a trial process in England at the time this was going on. There's a few words from O'Donovan. MP Colivett, a committed Republican, released from prison, he spoke in the same terms, supporting the ideals of a republic. He expressed the hope that they would not depart in the slightest degree from the vision of Patrick Pearse, and he hoped that the peace talks in London would be based on government by consent of the government. On the 16th of October, Cato Callahan made a significant speech to the Gaelic League, and again these were her aspirations. She praised the separatist ideals of Pearse and Terence McSweeney and affirmed that the Irish Republican Army fought to make this separation a reality. Please God, we shall see that separation soon. So we have the clear idea in Limerick that these leading people were reluctant, hostile to making any concession to English demands. Now to continue, the talks then continued into another phase. They reopened on the 24th of October, and an interesting observation on their character at that time, Thomas Jones, the Cabinet Secretary, reported, that as the seventh session of the talks resumed, Andy Cope, at the request of Griffith and Collins, had arranged a private meeting with Lloyd George and Chamberlain before the afternoon session. Cope had met Collins soon after the truce of the 11th of July, and their relationship clearly influenced the character of the sub-conference talks that determined the final articles of agreement. So the talks that we're dealing with now are sub-conference, a smaller group, not the full plenary sessions of talks. There was a short break from London to return for a cabinet meeting. And the interesting thing is, it did not discuss so much the terms of the talks, but it discussed the loyalty of the army. And a resolution was passed that the army of the Republic has but one allegiance, namely to the elected government of the Republic. That was the cabinet decision at the time of the 25th of November, and clearly was a reflection on the perceived danger of the IRB. They then returned to the talks, and Griffith and Collins renewed their efforts to secure a settlement. However, their proposals of the 28th of November drew from Lloyd George yet another response of "this means war," and a call by him on the 29th of November to say whether Ireland was in or out of the empire. The deteriorating situation led Griffith to call for a cabinet meeting with De Valera for the 3rd of December. While those talks were proceeding in London, De Valera had, possibly with concern for the army, departed from Dublin, tour of Galway and Clare, and passed through Limerick. And the only significance in Limerick was, I think it's possibly at that stage, the grant of him receiving the freedom of Limerick was considered and resolved. Because this is what happened. The corporation met on Thursday, the 1st of December, and Maura O'Donovan, the acting mayor, proposed that both De Valera and Kathleen Clark should receive their awards on Monday, the 5th of December, in the Theatre Royal. That seems to be the time on which it was determined to renew the promised freedom of 1918. We now turn to a cabinet meeting of the 3rd of December. It considered the British Articles of Agreement. So the Griffith, Collins, they all return, and it's a fairly crucial meeting to decide on future policy. The British proposal swore to swear true oath and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State, to the community of nations known as the British Empire, and to the King as head of the state and of the empire. That was the proposal brought back on the 3rd of December. De Valera made it clear that he could not subscribe to such an oath and was not satisfied with the situation of Northern Ireland. He wanted complete rejection. Griffith and Collins were not in favour of complete rejection, and Griffith proposed that the delegates should sign and leave it to the Dáil to reject, thereby giving a clear indication of what he and Collins were actually to do in a few days' time. They then went back to begin the final negotiations. The next report we have is from the Griffith in London that the talks had broken down, but the British had noted that Collins had not attended the final talk and began private discussions with him and Arthur Griffith. At midnight on the 4th of December, Griffith met Thomas Jones, the Secretary of the English Cabinet, for talks, and told him, this is Jones recorded this, he and Collins had been completely won over to belief in Lloyd George's promises and appealed for help to present a case that would win support in Dublin. Collins then met Lloyd George privately on the morning of the 5th of December. It was at this time that De Valera began his journey to Limerick to receive the freedom of the city. That we'll now consider the freedom of the city. He arrived on the 5th of December, and I'll repeat this a few times, but as he arrives in, the delegates in London are engaged in their meetings with Lloyd George. We've received the context already. Maura O'Donovan is giving him and Kathleen Clark the freedom. They're all welcome, they're all applauded. A significant speech was made by De Valera. Firstly, he made references to his family connections with Limerick, and he noted that the casket in which the certificate of honorary freedom was being presented was a replica of the stone on which the broken Treaty of Limerick had been signed in 1691. De Valera then declared that the motto, "Remember Limerick," should serve as a guide at the time of the present negotiations. He said that "Remember Limerick" then has been for us a motto. It may have saved us from mistakes on certain occasions, and we badly need to follow it now. He then referred to the current state of the negotiations and made these observations. He said they should have little hesitation in rejecting the proposals if they were not what they wanted or what they pretended to be. This was no idle talk on his part, because what they said they meant. He concluded by saying that Ireland was a separate nation and that they, England, never, not to the end of time, will get from this nation allegiance to their rulers. So while he is speaking in these terms, very Republican, strong language, events were happening in London. Collins, Griffith, all meeting with Lloyd George. And the Whitehall diary of Thomas Jones, secretary to Lloyd George, provides remarkable details, hour by hour, minute by minute. A few examples. 9:30 a.m., that's the morning that De Valera is receiving the freedom. Michael Collins met Lloyd George at number 10 Downing Street and agreed to return in the afternoon. 3 p.m., exactly as De Valera is speaking, Lloyd George and his advisors met Griffith, Collins and Barton. 2:10 a.m., the final agreement was signed. The Irish signatories were Griffith, Collins, Barton, Duggan and Gavin Duffy. The final form of the oath, which was presented under a threat of war to the Irish delegation for signature, was fundamentally that which had been negotiated between Collins and Lloyd George. It read, I'll read a little bit, "I do solemnly swear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State, as by law established, and that I will be faithful to His Majesty King George V, his heirs and successors, in virtue of the common citizenship of Ireland with Great Britain, and her adherence to a member of the group of nations forming the British Commonwealth." That was the final form of the oath. It was a far cry from the Republican ideals of De Valera expressed in his speech at Limerick. And with that, we will make a few words of conclusion. Before saying a little bit of conclusion, might do in passing to note, many historians have asked, why was there no phone call from London to Dublin? Well, obviously De Valera was not in Dublin, he was in Limerick. But the Stephen O'Mara papers, now in the University of Limerick, reveal quite clearly, I read them years ago, reveal quite clearly a phone call was made. Stephen O'Mara Sr. sent a phone call, a cable to his son Stephen O'Mara Jr. in America saying, "Treaty signed this morning." So De Valera knew, but he did not know the terms. And it was only when he knew the terms later on, a few days later, 24 hours later, that the seriousness became apparent. So the conclusion has to focus on, I'm afraid, divisions in Irish life. The divisions manifested themselves In the Cabinet decision of the 8th of December to accept the treaty terms, but only by a vote of 4-3. Griffith, Collins, Barton and Cosgrave approved. De Valera, Brewer and Stack were opposed. That evening, De Valera issued a public statement saying that, quotation, "I cannot recommend the acceptance of this treaty either to Dáil Éireann or to the country." The Catholic bishops presented a view which challenged that of De Valera. Cardinal Logue and 5 other bishops, including Bishop Callahan of Limerick and Bishop Fogarty of Clare, they also supported the treaty. That was the way it went. The Dáil debate on the treaty began on the 14th of December and ended on the 7th of January 1922 with a vote of 64 to 57 in favour of acceptance. The country then moved to a divisive general election and to civil war. The bare statistics do not reveal the deep personal suffering and mental turmoil that affected all those involved. I conclude with a few examples of that personal turmoil in regard to Limerick. Cato Callahan embodied all of these sentiments, from the heroine status that she enjoyed after her husband's murder. She spoke 20th of December and voted against the treaty, and ended up on hunger strike in Mountjoy prison in 1923. Incidentally, all 6 women deputies, including Kathleen Clark, voted against the treaty, and many other women were on hunger strike with Cato Callahan. Maura O'Donovan adopted exactly the same position as her sister. As deputy mayor, she refused permission for a motion in favour of accepting the treaty to be put to the Limerick Corporation on the 5th of January 1922. The O'Mara family, which has figured prominently in this story, embodied the deep national divisions. Stephen O'Mara Sr. accepted the treaty and became a member of the Free State Senate in 1925. His son James, who had played a major part in the election campaign of 1918, and who had worked with De Valera in America, supported the treaty and represented Cumann na Gael in the Dáil from 1924 to 1927. Alphonsus O'Mara, the mayor at the time of the first granting of the freedom of the city to De Valera, also supported the treaty. However, Stephen O'Mara Jr. opposed the treaty, and although the Lord Mayor of Limerick, having been re-elected in January 1922, he was imprisoned in November 1922. Speaking in Limerick, it is fitting finally to conclude with a reference to the city's motto, Remember Limerick. Remember Limerick and the broken treaty of 1691, which denied national independence and led to religious persecution. Remember Limerick and the treaty of 1921, which resulted in a divided country and a divided people. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel. I'm a historian with a particular interest in labour history in early 20th century Ireland. So today we're going to look at labour history in Limerick from 1917 to 1922, focusing mainly on some of the Soviets and strikes that occurred in Limerick between 1919 and 1921. But before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Matthew Potter of Limerick Museum for his invitation to be part of this symposium, and William O'Neill for his help in facilitating this event. So the idea of organised labour came to Ireland at a relatively late stage in comparison to other European countries. In Ireland, existing trade unions were usually branches of already established English trade unions that represented skilled workers and skilled craftsmen as opposed to unskilled or ordinary workers. So low wages, poor housing conditions, long hours and generally poor working conditions were some of the factors that contributed to the growth of the Irish labour movement. So the rise in labour in Ireland brought with it the demand for labour representation, not just at a local level, but at a government level and on elected bodies throughout the country. So two of the main figures of the Irish labour movement were James Connolly and James Larkin, both of whom believed that all workers in Ireland, whether skilled or unskilled, should be represented by Irish trade unions. So in 1909, James Larkin founded the Irish Transport and General Workers Union to represent Dublin's unskilled workforce, and he believed in the theory of syndicalism, which was the belief that all workers should unite in one great union and use sympathetic strikes to achieve better working conditions. So as you can imagine, this movement gathered momentum and membership of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union greatly increased throughout Ireland, but naturally this led to conflict between the Irish Transport and General Workers Union and employers, particularly in Dublin, namely William Martin Murphy, and this led to the Dublin lockout of September 1913. However, when James Larkin left for America in 1914, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union was then led by James Connolly. He had similar syndicalist beliefs, and he also believed that socialism and national independence went hand in hand, and that the cause for Ireland was the cause for Labour, and the cause for Labour was the cause for Ireland. He believed that the coming Irish Revolution would be both socialist and nationalist in nature. So 1916 to 1919 was a turning point in Ireland's political landscape, and it was a period when national independence and socialist revolution were both genuine possibilities. Socialism and revolution was spreading across Europe, and Ireland, albeit a small country, was no exception. Trade union membership rapidly increased in Ireland during this time period. And in 1920, the post-war economic boom hit a slump, and this led to social unrest in Ireland, and this gradually turned into struggles against wage cuts that were imposed by employers and farmers throughout Ireland. So in 1917, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union reached Limerick, and within a year their membership had reached almost 3,800 people. And in 1919, Limerick was placed under martial law by the British Army in response to the killing of an RIC member in Limerick. Checkpoints were set up on every road in and out of Limerick City and County, and all persons travelling and all workers were required to have a permit in order to be permitted to travel to work. In response to this, the Limerick Trades Council called a general strike, which lasted 2 weeks, and this became known as the Limerick Soviet. So the Trades Council, which was also nicknamed the Soviet, distributed food, controlled prices in the city, organised the provision of essential services, and published its own newspaper, and even created its own currency during these 2 weeks. However, after 2 weeks, the British authorities agreed to cancel the imposed martial law, and the Soviet was seen as a success. So the Limerick Soviet was not an isolated event. Many smaller disputes took place in Limerick in 1919 and in subsequent years. The most well-known being the Knocklong Soviet in 1920 and the Brewery Soviet in 1921, both of which occurred in companies owned by the Cleves family. So the Cleves family were an extremely wealthy and unionist family who owned many companies throughout Limerick and Munster. For example, the Cleves Condensed Milk Company, and their companies had a terrible reputation for poor working conditions, and the wages that they paid their unskilled workers were some of the lowest in the country. So as you can expect, these poor working conditions were the subject of many bitter disputes and inspired a number of Soviets throughout Limerick. So In May of 1920, Cleeve's Creamery in Knocklong was occupied by the workers, and along with the main creamery, 12 auxiliary creameries were also occupied. So the main issue that the Knocklong Creamery workers had was that the wages they were paid were lower than that of their colleagues in other branches of the company in different parts of Munster. So their colleagues had greatly improved their position through strikes and local wage bargaining. So one of the first actions of the workers of the Knocklong Creamery was to remove the Cleeve's nameplate from the entrance and from all packaging, and the workers hung a banner over the entrance which read, "Knocklong Soviet Creamery, we make butter, not profits." So at the time, such workplace occupations in Ireland were almost unknown and were seen as quite a radical move for such a conservative and predominantly rural country. The occupation lasted 5 days, and throughout the occupation, local farmers continued to supply milk to the creamery, and work continued as normal with the company's products, butter, cheese and condensed milk being produced and delivered to the creamery's regular customers. So eventually Cleeve's conceded a wage increase backdated to the previous March, and the creamery was handed back to the owners. Other concessions included the introduction of a 48-hour working week, 14 days holidays between the 1st of June and the 1st of October, and a better ventilation system for the creamery. So this was seen as a huge success, and this victory greatly increased the membership and prestige of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, not just in Limerick but throughout the country. And the following year, another Soviet took place in East Limerick in August of 1921 at a mill and bakery in Ruairc, which was also owned by the Cleeve's family. So it is believed that this dispute originated because of the sacking of one or more workers in the previous November, and the Irish Transport and General Workers Union demanded that these workers be reinstated with their wages backdated for the time that they had to spend out of work. However, management of the mill and bakery refused the demand, and the grievance festered until the following August, when workers led a seizure of the mill and bakery, and a notice appeared in many national newspapers stating brewery, mills and bakery are now the property of the workers. The mill and shop are open for the sale of bread, flour and meal. It is hoped to reduce prices and do away with profiteering within a day by order of the workers. So similarly to Knocklong, the workers of the brewery, mill and bakery also hung a banner from the door stating "Brewery, Soviet mills, we make bread, not profits," and they awarded themselves a pay increase and claimed to have also increased productivity. So news of this Soviet reached Liberty Hall in Dublin, and following talks in Liberty Hall, the dispute ended and workers returned the premises to Cleeve's. However, it is unclear under what terms they returned to work, although it is rumoured that Constance Markievicz, who was the Minister for Labour in the Dáil cabinet at the time, had threatened to use the IRA to forcibly end the Soviet if necessary. And in December 1921, so shortly after the Brewery Soviet, Cleeve's sought wage cuts and layoffs for almost 1/3 of their workers in Limerick, Tipperary, Waterford and Cork. So as you can imagine, the workers naturally rejected these proposed cuts, and a strike broke out at the Cleeve's plant in Lansdowne in Limerick City on the 13th of April in 1922. In May, the workers occupied the Cleeve's plants in Clonmel and other smaller places throughout Munster, and an attempt to occupy Lansdowne was failed when pro-treaty government ordered it to be garrisoned by troops. At the same time, machinery worth £3,000 was destroyed, and some of the creameries or Cleves companies were also burned down. So the outbreak of the Civil War in June 1922 put an end to the Soviets, and pro-treaty troops advanced into Munster. They crushed any remaining Soviets and their leaders. So the anti-treaty side was equally unsympathetic, and contrary to the expectations and beliefs of James Connolly, the Irish Revolution had proved to be a very socially conservative one. So, in saying that though, the Soviets did destroy the Cleves business empire, which only lasted 40 years after it was created. So they pushed the Cleves conglomerate into bankruptcy in 1923, and in 1927 or 1928 it was taken over by a semi-state body called the Dairy Disposal Company. So despite some local victories, the strikes and Soviets between 1919 and 1922 ended in the defeat of the workers. So James Connolly was executed in 1916, and James Larkin was in the US from 1914 to 1923, and this had deprived the Irish labour movement of its most dynamic and influential leaders. So the intense social conservationism of Sinn Féin and the IRA, the fear of communism, and the increasing cautions of the Irish trade union leadership were all factors in influencing this outcome. More fundamentally, Ireland outside of Ulster did not have a large industrial workforce, while political issues such as the treaty took precedence over social and economic issues. Although Ireland was to have a high rate of union membership in the 20th century, both the trade union movement and the Labour Party were conservative by European standards. So, nevertheless, the Limerick Labour agitation of 1917 to 1922 was one of the most interesting, heroic and unusual events in the history of modern Ireland, and it was such a turning point for Irish labour history, and it isn't as well known as I think it should be, and it deserves to be better remembered. And its slogan, "We make bread and butter, not profits," should be respected and cherished. Thank you.
My name is Dr. John Callahan. I lecture in St. Angela's College in Sligo, and today I want to talk to you about a man named Joseph Tracy. You may never have heard of Joseph Tracy. I don't think I'd call him a hero of the War of Independence. He's perhaps more of a victim. But all countries need heroes, and among Ireland's heroes are some of those who fought during the War of Independence. And the image of the freedom fighter has a prominent place in the history of the War of Independence, and in how we remember that story and in how we tell that story. In some ways, it's a part of Irish identity, I suppose. We remember those who won glory in the service of the national cause. We remember those who killed pursuing the national cause. As well as heroes, we very rightly identify villains. Among those would be members of the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries. And a century now after the War of Independence, the boys of the IRA, the rebels, are still celebrated in story and in song, and their deeds still stoke the popular imagination. The psychological power of guerrilla warfare took a hold of public perception very quickly at the time, and public opinion. And volunteers, members of the IRA, very quickly became almost legendary type figures.
And Ernie O'Malley wrote about this in his memoir On Another Man's Wound in the 1930s. He said, every one of our little fights or attacks was significant. They made panoramic pictures of the struggle in the people's eyes, and they lived on in their minds. And those pictures, those panoramas live on still, I think. In Limerick, in the city, for instance, we have the memorial to some of the martyrs of 1916 on Sarsfield Bridge there. We have, just metres away really, at the intersection of Callahan and Clancy Strands, there's the memorial to the murdered mayors, as they're known, George Clancy and Michael O'Callahan, and to volunteer Joseph O'Donoghue, who were killed by Crown forces on the 7th of March 1921. There's the Republican plot in Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery. There are other Republican memorials at spots around the city, so to John Collopy at Castletroy Cross on the Dublin Road, to Henry Clancy on the Ballysimon Road, to Michael Downey at St. Patrick's Hill, and to Thomas Keane, who was executed on the 4th of June 1921, and that memorial is in Sarsfield Barracks. Around the county then, Ballylanders, Bruff, and you have that particularly fine statue of Sean Wall in Bruff, who he was the East Limerick Brigadier, he was the chairman of the county council. At Drumkeen there's a memorial, at Galbally, at Kilmallock, Maru, Newcastle West, and there are more markers and there are many more ways of remembering. I'm speaking now in late 2021, so recently the West Limerick Old IRA Memorial Committee issued a 44-page booklet to mark the centenary of the death of Sean Finn, who was the Brigadier of the West Limerick IRA. Finn was from Rathkeil, and this booklet emphasises what it calls, quote, the courage and self-sacrifice of Finn and his colleagues. And the committee who put this booklet together, they hope, they say, that it will go some way towards perpetuating the memory of a true patriot, they call Finn, who had given so much to his community and his country, and who died long before his time. And the grandniece of Finn actually contributes to the booklet, and she highlights his bravery, his leadership ability. A grand-nephew of Finn describes him as tall, handsome, highly intelligent, a widely read young man, renowned for his piety and his athletic ability. He was a keen member of the Gaelic League, he was captain of the local football team, and he played with the hurlers too. And of course, Rathkeil GEA Club took Sean Finn's name. The booklet suggests that what is remembered and memorialised in a community can define the spirit of the people who live in that community. And the local memorial that there is to Finn, according to this booklet, will stand there for generations to come on a high-sloping field as a testimony to the idealism and the courage of a young man who was prepared to make the supreme sacrifice in the cause in which he believed, and also to the commitment of the people of West Limerick to ensure that he will always be remembered. And there's a verse in a poem about Sean Finn's death at Ballyroe. It reads as follows, it's included in this booklet as well. Full well he fought for Erin's right, the bravest of the brave, and battled with the tyrant's might, his comrades dear to save. And in that tight and heroic fight, he gave back blow for blow, till his young heart's blood rushed in a flood in the sod at Ballyroe. So naturally enough, because we admire certain qualities and achievements, we remember leaders, we remember those that we associate with glory in one way or another. We venerate our champions, our warriors, and we venerate and remember our fallen warriors. Now, we can't remember everybody, so picking and choosing is simply practical also. But what then of the revolutionaries who only suffered, who only sacrificed, who won no personal glory or who could bask in no reflected glory? And some of Limerick's revolutionaries from this time were forgotten very quickly, and some of them paid a very high price for participating in the War of Independence. Some of them were traumatized. And relatively few participants spoke in any depth about their war experiences. And trauma was probably a very significant legacy of the war on all sides. And many who fought actually in the War of Independence had previously been combatants in World War I, and that was a conflict that was closely associated with what was called shell shock at the time. So to come now to Joseph Tracy. Joseph Tracy was a member of the 2nd Battalion of the Mid-Limerick Brigade of the IRA, and he's a man actually about whom I know very little. I've never heard him discussed by anyone. I haven't seen his name in any newspaper report from the time or in any later account of events. I must keep looking for his name. But basically he wasn't a leading light. Where I found him, or a vague outline of him, at least a trace of him, is in the applications that he made under the Army Pension and the Military Service Pensions Acts. So the Army Pensions Acts from 1923 to 1953, they dealt with wounded participants. And Tracy had been wounded. The Military Service Pensions Acts 1924, 34 and 1949, they dealt with surviving participants who could prove their active service. So Tracy's applications, these records, they offer infrequent snapshots of his life. It seemed to have been a difficult life, perhaps chaotic, perhaps squalid. So we get snapshots of his life between the time of the War of Independence up to the late 1960s. And in his own words, Tracy, to start his story, he says that he lost his mind. That's the phrase he used. He lost his mind after he sustained a severe beating from Crown forces in March 1921 in Limerick City. And after that, he spent 6 months as a patient in what was then known as the Limerick District Lunatic Asylum in Mulgrave Street. In 1922 then, he fought with the anti-treaty IRA before he was hospitalised again at the end of that year. He had what he called another nervous breakdown, was the phrase he used. We come then to 1924, and in 1924 the claim that he had made for a pension for the injuries he suffered was denied by the Free State. But at that time he had no fixed address, he had no income. We could surmise that he was homeless. Now ex-servicemen, veterans of World War I maybe, if they were suffering from shell shock, they were commonly diagnosed medically with what was called neurasthenia. And the Army Medical Board, who considered Tracy's application, they diagnosed him with traumatic neurasthenia. And the description that they gave of his symptoms was as follows: sleeplessness and pain in the head. Gets about 3.5 hours broken sleep per night. All jerks. Tremor of extended hands very marked. Walks with difficulty on a straight line. Inattentive. Symptoms suggest neurasthenia. One beating, which left practically no marks of injury, could not have caused this condition. So the army doubted basically that it was solely the beating that he had suffered at the hands of Crown forces that caused his condition. It's a decade before there's another trace of him in the paperwork. This is 1934. So at this point, he's described as homeless, destitute, existing on HA, which is home assistance, some kind of social service or social support, and a pensions branch official, a civil servant or bureaucrat, or public servant rather. Perhaps this individual had seen many of these cases like Tracy's. Perhaps they had succumbed at this point to despair or to callousness. But they judged Tracy as follows: naked and good for nothing but for the scrap heap, like every other human machine. Now that certainly seems to be a very harsh and cruel way to think of a veteran of the War of Independence or any individual in need. 1939 then. Tracy in 1939 was living in a billiards room at Bank Place in the city. There was a James O'Mahony who clearly felt strongly enough about Tracy to petition the Minister for Defence on behalf of Tracy. The Minister for Defence at this time was Oscar Traynor, who himself was a veteran of the War of Independence. So James O'Mahony writes to Traynor, coupled with his condition, Tracy's condition, this state of affairs is rapidly undermining his health and, if allowed to continue, will send to an early grave one who has given the best years of his life in the service of his country. In 1940, then, a year later, Tracy himself wrote to Oscar Traynor, I am a most unfortunate case, he wrote. I have not a copper to my name or no one to give it to me because I cannot approach my friends who have been so good to me in the past. I live in an old cellar and for long periods without food or clothes until charitable people come to my aid. And Tracy stayed at Bank Place throughout the 1940s. In 1951 then, a doctor, an army doctor, certified him as suffering from, or a doctor at least working for the army, certified Tracy as suffering from general debility and chronic bronchitis and emphysema. And the Army Pensions Board provided further detail or added to that picture. Complains of continuous noise in the left ear. Sometimes both ears, gets dizzy and falls. Does not get sufficient to eat. Not well nourished. Mental condition poor. Reports that the applicant, Tracy, spent some time abusing St. Patrick at night. This is verbally abusing St. Patrick. And there was a diagnosis of what was called inadequate psychopathic personality. And physically, he was thin and wasted. He was incapable of self-support by reason of permanent infirmity. Now, he was never deemed eligible for a pension, despite actually being awarded service medals. But he was finally, at this point, 1951, is finally provided with a special allowance. He also actually had to move from his building at Bank Place in 1951 because it was due to be demolished. And from 1951 until 1967, Tracy made his home in rent-free accommodation at Cornmarket Row. Now, this accommodation at Cornmarket Row, it was listed as unfit for human occupation in 1957, but it wasn't actually condemned for another decade. Joseph Tracy died in 1968, and at the time of his death, he was living in a hostel in St. John's Square in Townster. Perhaps there are people in Limerick who might remember him. Joseph Tracy's is a sad story, but it's not a unique one, I'm sure. By no means am I proposing that a memorial be erected to him, but what I do suggest is that it's important for us to find out more about Tracy and other men and women like him, and to remember them alongside the heroes that we remember.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Stephen Griffin, and I'm here to just give you a brief overview of what Limerick society and city's social life was like in 1921. Now, the Bishop of Limerick from between 1886 and 1917, Bishop Edward O'Dwyer, he had reputedly once said that Limerick was the most Catholic city in the world. And at this point in time, roughly around 1921, about 95% of the population is Catholic. But there is a Protestant minority and a very tiny Jewish community in the city also. Now, religious organizations really do have a strong presence in Limerick social life at this time. I mean, the Archon Fraternity of the Holy Family had been in Limerick since 1868, and they were headquartered at the Mount St. Alphonsus Church. And in 1921, they have a membership of about 6,000 men, and their own estimate is that they have a couple of thousand boys as well. And in July of 1921, the confraternity are bestowed with this special papal benediction. And at their half-yearly general communion, which was always offered for its confraternity members, and that's held in October of 1921, over 2,877 men alone attend Sunday Mass at 8 a.m. and crowds of 600 to 700 are reputed to have attended both the 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. Masses on that day as well. Now, there were numerous, I should say, religious festivities throughout the year. St. Patrick's Day, all the churches where it was deemed possible, they were instructed to expose the Blessed Sacrament for the public, for public adoration, from last Mass until benediction. And during Easter week, there is a very large congregation gathered at the Augustinian Church for to pray for the spiritual and temporal welfare of the country. And you get large processions at St. Mary's Convent during the Feast of Corpus Christi. And these processions consist of nuns, teachers, and school children, all dressed in white dresses with veils. But elsewhere, somewhere like Glynn, for example, you get the Corpus Christi procession is held in the grounds of the Convent of Mercy, and this included all the children from the local industrial schools and parish schools. Now, the Franciscan church on Henry Street, that was still being completed in 1921, and work had begun on that in 1876, and it's not going to finish until 1931. Still a good 10 years for that church to be completed. And throughout the year, you see in the newspapers that they're constantly holding collections for renovations and repairs to St. John's Cathedral. And there are plans to improve the painting and decoration of the building's interior. Now, St. Munchin's parish decided that they're going to build a new church, and the foundation stone for that is laid on Sunday, 1st of January. And the estimated cost was £29,200. And it was so expensive that the parish organised a number of events, fundraising events, throughout the year. And there's all sorts of different events. They have garden fetes, they have what they call the Treaty Stone Sweep Race, and they have concerts as well. And then in October, St. Vincent de Paul Society, they established what they call the Limerick Catholic Literature Services Guild Hurling Club. And the general idea behind this club was, and I quote, to keep the boys fit and to ensure the regular distribution of clean and healthy literature, unquote. And boys who wanted to join the club, they would be required to hand out Catholic literature throughout the different districts of the city. Now, nowadays, we have in Limerick, we have schools such as CBS Sexton Street and Laurel Hill, and they continue to operate on the same sites as they did in 1921. Other schools such as St. Munchin's College and Villiers, they were there in that year, but they hadn't moved to the current campuses where we know they are now. A number of other different schools, such as Leamy's School, St. Philomena's, they were in operation in 1921, they no longer operate now. And some of the problems which we see that schools experience today, such as overcrowding, that was a problem 100 years ago. And there are 4 Christian Brothers schools in Limerick at this time, and there are about 1,500 pupils attending the 4 of those. And there's a real troubling lack of space at CVS Sexton Street in 1921, because not only was it a school, it also housed an orphanage as well. And it was just an increasing problem that there was no room. And the boys of the orphanage eventually are sent to Glynn in 1928, and the school on Sexton Street becomes renovated to deal with the demand for school places, to deal with this overcrowding issue. Now, overcrowding is also an issue in Limerick County, and in Kilmallock, you see townspeople and parishioners at the Peter and Paul School. They're planning, they're voting and deciding on constructing a new building to deal with that problem as well. So, some things never change in a sense, do they? Now, schools also organised a lot of fundraising events to maintain their upkeep. So all the different churches in the city, we often see that they held special collections for the Christian Brothers each May. And they do this in 1921 as well. But the Christian Brothers aren't the only ones. Laurel Hill would host garden fetes. And in 1921, they have theirs on the week of the 16th, 17th of May. And it was a pretty popular occurrence. They have concerts, they have dances held by the pupils. Now, aside from, those schools, there are a number of different post-primary, courses which are available for young people. To teach people shorthand, typewriting, bookkeeping, and kind of just more sort of general, I suppose, what we would now call business studies, what people in the 1920s called, business methods. So, you get the likes of the Hardy & Co. Commercial Academy at number 38 Connolly Street. And they offer classes, and so too does the Munster Connaught College at the Clare Chamber. And they usually help with exam preparation as well. Elsewhere on Mallow Street, you have Madame de Prinz, which provided private lessons to prepare students for exams. But there are lots of afternoon and evening courses as well, particularly for young women who were interested in studying business. And you get the example of Dowsley's Commercial School on Kentwood Street, which provides those types of courses. Now, elsewhere, in somewhere like Pallaskenry, you have the Salesian College of Mary, Help of Christians, which offer religious courses and agricultural courses to boys, usually between the ages of 12 and 19. Lots of different scholarships are also available at this point in time, and we see a lot of young people being awarded scholarships, and we see advertisements for scholarships in the likes of the Limerick Leader. So, to take one example, in February 1921, the Limerick County Committee awards £25 to a Mr. John Kelly, who had been a student at Ballinagary Boys' School, and he obtained the highest marks in science in the King's Scholarship exam. And with the award he receives, he's able to go to Dublin to St. Patrick's Teacher Training College. And there's, as I've said, there are loads of other examples. The trustees of the Limerick Endowment for Technical Education would provide scholarships. They offered 2 scholarships each year, worth £24 each. And these were intended to enable girls between 16 and 25 to study at the Dundrum Convent School of Domestic Economy. And the trustees also offered scholarships for boys as well, worth £25 to study in the Salesian College of Agriculture. But there's also art scholarships. You get, a scholarship to study singing in Dublin was awarded to one Mr. Patrick Sheehan of John Square, and he beat 100 other applicants to receive that award. Now, Limerick has, as we all know, has always possessed a very strong, very proud and active sporting tradition. And there are numerous local, national and international sporting events throughout 1921 which attracted public interest, and these include athletics, boxing, cricket, hurling, rowing, and of course rugby. The first games for the hurling season in that year is a senior match played between Callahan and Young Ireland's, and there's also a junior game as well between Connolly and Shamrocks. Now, for the junior game, Connolly didn't travel, and it's called off. But the senior match was played, it did go ahead. And according to the leader, the full-time score was Callahan 4 goals and 2 points to Young Ireland's 3 goals and 2 points. Now, the Munster Championship began on Sunday, 4th September. And that was between Limerick and Tipperary, in Thurles. And Tipperary won that match by 3 goals and 4 points to 4 goals. But the two sides meet again on the 18th September at the Markets Field to play for gold medals. And Tipperary once again come out on top, and this time they win by 5 goals and 1 point to Limerick's 4 goals and 4 points. And then the two sides play one last time that year on 27 November, and that's again at the Markets Field. And this time Limerick won by 4 goals and 3 points to 3 goals and 2 points. Of course, we have the rowing clubs, and we have the members of the Shannon, and both the Shannon and St. Michael's rowing clubs. They're all, along with the Limerick Boating Club and the Limerick Regatta Committee, they're all representing the city at this time in the Irish Rowing Union. And in addition to that, you have the Flunkert Boat Club, St. Michael's Boat Club, and the Shannon Rowing Club, and they're all taking part in the Dublin Regatta on 24th, 25th of June. Now, in rugby, which had long been popular throughout the city, Munster played Leinster on 15 January 1921. And then in February, during internationals, Dennis Cusson of Newcastle West played for Ireland against Scotland. And that was on the 26th of February. And Ireland won that match by 9 points to 8. And then on 9th of April, Mr. PJ Stokes of Garryowen lined out for Ireland against France in Paris. Now, Dennis Cusson was in the headlines a number of times throughout the year. He appears on 18th of May. He's reported to have won 3 events: the 100 yards, 200 yards, and the long jump at the Irish Amateur Athletic Association Championship. And then in July, he went on to represent Ireland again at the International Athletic Contest. Now, of course, horse racing and boxing were also very popular, and Limerick Leader in particular regularly published the latest horse race results, which it received by special telegram from across Ireland and Britain. But a lot of attention throughout the year was devoted to a very well publicized world heavyweight boxing match, a title defense between Jack Dempsey and Georges Carpentier, and that was held in Jersey City, New Jersey on 2nd July 1921. And the leader reported on this quite a lot. And this said, this fight is, and I quote, it's expected to be the greatest bout of pugilism in modern times. And for a finish, Jack Dempsey won. He won the match by a knockout in the 4th round. Now, a lot of news in Limerick's newspapers in that year, a lot of it concerns what is going on in the courts. And in turn, a lot of that also relates to the War of Independence. Munster at this point in time, all of it was under martial law. And, if you deface martial law proclamations, you could be fined up to £25. Now, the Limerick courts paid a lot of compensation to those who were affected by the ongoing war. And these claimants, they could be military personnel, they could be civilians. And you get a lot of examples of British soldiers appearing and receiving compensation. To give an example, you have, one chap called Lieutenant Watling of the RAF, and he receives £2,000 compensation for a gunshot wound he received during an ambush in December 1920. Another gentleman called Henry Nathan from St Albans in the UK, he applied for £3,000 after his son, who was a constable, was killed on Edward Street in August 1920. A lot of people who lost property during IRA attacks on barracks often looked for compensation. In October 1920, the Black Boy Pike Barracks was burned, and a man who lived next door to that, a Mr. William Keane, received £750 in damages in January 1921. His house went on fire, and the items, a number of the items that were destroyed were reportedly £25 in cash, 2 sets of valuable bagpipes, 2 silver watches, his wardrobe, and his wearing apparel. £28,500 were awarded to Lady Ida Massey after the burning of Hermitage House in Connolly. And in the county then, in Kilmallock, their Petty Sessions Court hadn't been in operation since the RIC barracks in the area had been destroyed in May 1920. One Cornelius O'Hurley from Kilmallock, he receives £2,000 after his shop premises were burned in that attack. A fellow who owned the lease on the barracks by the name of Captain Lindsay, he receives £2,000 as well. So, the Petty Sessions Court in Kilmallock didn't return until April 1921. And those first hearings, the first hearings are really concerned with an attack on a cow and a breach of licensing laws. And really, agrarian crime is not uncommon in the newspaper reports of the day. And there are a lot of disputes, often, they often end with cattle being stolen or hay being burnt. In the city's own Petty Sessions Court, you get a lot of different fines for many different types of offences. If you cycle on the footpath, if you damage furniture, domestic violence, drunkenness, larceny, or even travelling on trains without a ticket, you can end up in court for that. And in one reported instance from 23rd of May. The publican is found to have been operating on a Sunday outside of hours, and the RIC constable is doing his rounds. He walks in, he finds 3 men in the pub's kitchen with pints of stout in front of them, and there's a number of different reports like that throughout the year. It seems to have been a recurring issue. And I mean, a fine for that type of behaviour, it can range from anywhere between 2 shillings and 6 pence to 40 shillings. Now, 1921, and you have the War of Independence, and you have a lot of labour unrest, and that really dominates coverage of Limerick in national news, particularly an incident in brewery. I mean, on 1st September, the Irish Times is reporting that the Cleves' mill and brewery, it's been occupied by local ITGWU members who are in a dispute with the mill's owners, and they place a sign that says, "Brewery Soviet Workers Mills, we make bread, not profits." They placed that over the building. Now, that entire dispute arose because 2 workers were dismissed from the mill, and then the building is seized when the owner refuses to reinstate the workers and to pay them for that period of time when they were out of work. And eventually, a settlement is reached quite quickly, and the factory is handed back over to those who owned it on 3rd of September. Now, Limerick is making international headlines at this time. This is the year when you have the murders of Mayors Clancy and Callahan and Joseph O'Donoghue on that March 1921. The New York Times has the headline, "Mayor of Limerick is shot dead in bed." And they're reporting that Limerick was a city of tragedy following those events on the night of 6th and 7th of March. The Chicago Tribune has the headline, "Limerick mayor and ex-officials claim their homes." And then April 1921, the New York Times is informing its readers that Limerick City is under this 4 p.m. curfew following an attack on an RIC patrol. And the paper is describing how Limerick civilians are ordered to keep their windows open to avoid damage from explosions. And after that notice is given at about 6 p.m., explosions are heard, and houses and business premises are bombed and destroyed. There are reports of elderly women being kicked out of their houses by soldiers, and that auxiliaries are whipping individuals they find in the streets. Now, this event took place on John Street, and according to the English papers, the Manchester Guardian, the Dublin Castle is stating that this was a military operation because of an earlier attack on police. Now, the Times in London very briefly reports that a bomb was thrown at the local RIC barracks, and then there were some casualties and arrests. But elsewhere, you have the New York Times reports quite a lot on these events. It reports about a Sinn Féin boycott of British goods in Kilmallock. The Manchester Guardian writes of a battle between Crown forces and 150 civilians. And that's in Limerick County, this encounter, which lasts 5 hours, and 2 soldiers and 6 civilians are killed, and another 15 civilians are wounded. And then the Washington Post reports on the death of Winifred Barrington of Glenstall in Tipperary, and that was in May 1921. Now, Limerick's candidates for the second Dáil, they were chosen by Sinn Féin at a meeting in April 1921, and it's decided that Kate O'Callahan and Michael Collivat would represent the borough of Limerick, and Dr. Richard Hayes and William Hayes. They were chosen to represent East Limerick. Now, at this time, Kerry and Limerick West are their own constituency, the Form 1 constituency. And at a meeting held in Tralee, a number of representatives are chosen, and these include the Austin Stack, Pierce Beasley, Con Collins, Thomas O'Donoghue. I mean, Con Collins is really the only one from Limerick that's chosen. But all these candidates, they're all returned unopposed on 13th May 1921. Now, 2 months later, we have the Truce in July. And the Limerick papers are reporting that there's celebrations with an enthusiasm that's hardly ever been witnessed in the last couple of years. And the curfew which the city had been under is lifted. And as negotiations begin between Sinn Féin and the British, you see that the editors in particular the Limerick Leader, offering a lot of their own thoughts on what they think about the future of the country. And that's generally in the latter few months of 1921. Now, when following the signing of the treaty, the paper declared on 7th December, and I quote, "The fight of 7.5 centuries has ended in triumph. The settlement come to, in our opinion, gives us all the essentials of freedom. We have arrived at a momentously important and inspiring stage in our country's history, and the duty of every Irishman today is to make and act upon a resolve, to do what he can to prove worthy of the sacrifices made for Irish freedom." Unquote. On 28th December, the Leader publishes their article where they basically ask everyone to accept the treaty. And then 2 days later, on 30th December, they're calling for the treaty to be ratified and for peace. And that really does bring me through our little short discussion of Limerick in 1921. And I really do hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you very much for your time.